are continuing, as you know, our studies of the history of the church, and coming this morning to the end of the third major period of time. We've sort of divvied church history up into several slices. If you've been in the class, you know that. The first slice was ancient Christianity, going up to the year 500, and then what we call medieval Christianity, from 500 to 1000. And I don't know that I've really said this, but I should, so you'll have something to tuck in your notes somewhere. But we're calling this whole segment now pre-Reformation Christianity, from 1000 to 1500. I think probably a Roman Catholic here wouldn't appreciate that, as if the whole purpose of this 500 years is just to get ready for the Reformation. But I'm going to tip my Protestant disposition a little bit and let you know that that's the way I'm regarding this, because it does seem to me that a lot of what happens during this 500-year period of time, even the Crusades, certainly the Renaissance, and especially this morning as we look at these who are called the pre-Reformation reformers, all of these seem to weave together in some significant way leading up to this cataclysmic change in European history, which we are still, of course, living in, this great event that we call the Protestant Reformation. And so that's we're just completing now this period that I'm calling pre-Reformation Christianity. Next week we will actually move to the life of Martin Luther, and next week's lecture will be devoted in its entirety to the life and times of Martin Luther. Fascinating character, bigger than life, one of those figures that just stands out in bold relief, and my humble attempt to try to encapsulate his life in a 45-minute discussion will be woefully inadequate, but I hope you'll find your way back, because I think you'll find it interesting and certainly inspiring to hear something of how God used that great figure in history. So this morning we're going to be looking at the two figures who are generally go under this rubric, pre-Reformation reformers. Last time we were together, we were looking also at the Renaissance and at Savonarola. Savonarola is sometimes included among these three, if you count them as three, but I'm not including Savonarola because even though he was certainly a great reformer and had a dazzling career, complex career, as we were noting when we were together last, nevertheless, you would still say that Savonarola was always really a son of the Catholic Church. He never really raised issues that went to the doctrine of the church, but his concern was much more a moral reformation. He was critical of the really collapse at that point in the life of the hierarchy in the church. Whereas this morning, when we come to John Wycliff and John Huss, these two, we find people who are not only lodging a critique of the church at the point of her moral life, but also her theological life. And they are both highly anticipatory to Luther. In some ways, the thought that you find in Wycliffe and in Huss is the same thing you find in Luther. And indeed, Luther himself was accused early in his career of being a heretic in the line of a Hussite, as he was called. And that was a crime to which he was happy to confess. He regarded himself as a Hussite. And so we find that they do share some common theological thoughts. But it just so happens that while Wycliffe and Huss both are sort of bright lights that flame out, but no great reformation actually occurs following their lives, in the case of Luther, finally, Luther is the one for whom the thing finally takes off and the Protestant Reformation gets underway. It could have happened with Wycliffe. It could have happened with Huss. It's just that we hadn't quite arrived at the time historically where it could happen. Paul uses the term in the New Testament, the fullness of times, to describe the moment of Christ's birth. And there was a kind of fullness of times that was associated with the Reformation. And so certainly Luther, in terms of his timing, came at that moment that would be the so-called fullness of times in Western history. All right, well, with that brief introduction, let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Father, we are indeed deeply grateful again for the opportunity that is ours by your grace and in your mercy to gather and review the way in which you have been moving in history and lifting up those great men and women throughout the pages of your story in history to accomplish purposes that continue to be to our great benefit. And we pray that especially this morning as we briefly survey the lives of these two that you use so mightily, John Wycliff and John Huss, that their memory would serve to inspire us to similar courage as we would in our day be those that represent Christ in a manner similar to the way they did in theirs, and that all of this would be to the glory of Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. All right, Wycliffe, sometimes called, I've seen this in historical commentators more than once, the morning star of the Reformation. It's that first little glimpse of light that really does anticipate as a harbinger what the Reformation would eventually become. Wycliffe was born in the community called Wycliffe, probably better pronounced Wycliffe, but I typically hear it as Wycliffe, and so I'm going to use that pronunciation, but that's in England, near Yorkshire, and hence his name was John of Wycliffe, which of course eventually was simply contracted to John Wycliffe, and that's how we know him at this point. John Wycliffe was a scholar. He certainly wasn't the kind of effervescent personality that you'd see in a Luther or even in a Huss. He was more of a cerebral kind of person. He doesn't give us a whole lot of personal anecdotal information that we would find readily available for Luther and for others. He was of Saxon blood there in England. He was a student who did well at Oxford and made that transition, as sometimes happens, from being a brilliant student to being a brilliant teacher, staying at Oxford, and really throughout his career, he was a professor at Oxford, so his whole career operates more or less from that platform. He was a patriot, a powerful and really eloquent defender of England. The defense he was mounting, however, was not a defense against another country, but rather a defense against the Roman Catholic hierarchy. Because by this time in history, it had become common for the Roman Catholic Church to, by way of a kind of taxation system, reduce many of the nations of Europe, especially of Northern Europe, to a virtual poverty. And this was creating an awful lot of hostility in the popular mentality, and there were certain champions that rose to reflect and articulate that hostility. Wycliffe would be one of those in England. Huss would do the same thing in Bohemia. Certainly Luther did that in Germany. That part of what was the impulse behind the Reformation was an economic revolt against the heavy taxation that was being imposed through ecclesiastical impositions of various kinds. Probably Wycliffe is most famous because he's the one who first translates the Bible into English. And thus the name the Wycliffe Bible Translators took as their namesake when they organized their Bible translation mission was, of course, Wycliffe, because he's famous in the English-speaking world for that purpose. Wycliffe was also alive during the time which was a time of great loss of credibility for the papacy. We talked last time we were together about the Babylonian exile of the papacy, you recall, when it moved to Avignon, and then beginning in 1378, that was followed by the papal schism, in which there were first two, and then count them three different popes, all vying, all claiming to be the true pope of the church, and so on. And so this was a time when in the popular sentiment, people were just rolling their eyes, and for someone like Wycliffe to rise to the occasion and more or less distill that popular sentiment, it was really a time when you could capitalize on that and rally an awful lot of, you might say, localized support and nationalistic support against what was viewed as a kind of evil empire through the impositions of the church and so on. Up until the year 1366, I should mention to you that Wycliffe was born in 1324. So he's born about 50 years after the last crusade, just to get him in our chronological context here. Up until the time he was about 42 years old, we don't hear a lot about him, but at age 42, the year 1366, he actually shows up as one of the king's chaplains in England, which was a very prestigious role, and as such, he was an advisor not only to the king, but really more importantly to the Parliament. Parliament was given the question of whether or not they should catch up the financial arrearage to the church in Rome. This is like a kind of a papal taxation. And England had been refusing to pay that for some time. In fact, for about 33 years, they had been refusing in principle to pay that. They were objecting because of all of the confusion related to the leadership of the church. And the church was beginning to make some noises about really taking stronger measures. The strongest measure that the church or the Bishop of Rome could take theologically would be to put the nation under interdict, which was understood to mean that all the sacraments lost their efficacy, which would virtually condemn the entire population to loss of salvation and so on. The only thing the Pope could do beyond that would be to muster a crusade, which had mixed results in the past, and so this was not probably going to be a likely possibility. But nevertheless, the Pope was putting quite a bit of pressure on England to pay up the 33 years of back taxes, as it were, and Wycliffe was there encouraging Parliament to hold up, not pay it. And even the King John, had promised it would be paid, but Parliament said no, and you actually have the beginnings of the struggle between the King and Parliament. Even at this early date, which of course eventually, by the time of the Puritans, actually rewrites the whole sort of governmental philosophy in England at a later time. However, a few years later, when Wycliffe was about 50 years old now, the year 1374, again working on behalf of the king and on behalf of the government, he travels to France. Now, this is still during the time of the so-called Babylonian captivity, when the Pope is in Avignon, and Wycliffe travels to France to participate in negotiating a peace between England and France, which tended to be constantly at war, all through this time. They had their little skirmishes, and so Wycliffe was there trying to be a peacemaker in that regard. But also he was tasked with going to visit the Pope to negotiate some of the governmental positions that some of the ecclesiastics would hold in England. This was the first time he had actually met or visited the Pope or even been within that particular setting, and he was deeply disillusioned by the state of affairs there in the papal court. This is, again, there's striking similarities here. We're going to hear next time how Luther made a visit to Rome, and he had been a faithful son of the church until he saw the hierarchy of the church close up. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of his great loyalty to the church. Similarly with Wycliffe, he had up until this point had simply thought we could make some adjustments, fix what's broken here, but he certainly wasn't envisioning some great actual breach or separation from the church. But after he visited the Pope in Avignon and saw the moral state of things, he came back a changed man. He was converted, but certainly not converted in a positive way from the Roman Catholic point of view. And he began at that point to speak truly as a religious reformer in England. Very bold, very strong, very fiery. One quote, for example, this is to give you a flavor of the kind of thing Wycliffe would say. He described the Bishop of Rome as, quote, the Antichrist, the proud, worldly priest of Rome, and the most cursed of clippers and cut purses. You see, so that doesn't really win a lot of wide esteem from the Catholic side. He declared the Pope had, quote, no more power in binding and loosing than any priest, and that the temporal lords may seize the possessions of the clergy oppressed by necessity. So what he's arguing here is, number one, that the Pope doesn't have the moral or really theological authority to call the shots in England, and number two, England has sufficient sovereignty to say no to the authority of the Pope, and that the Pope is not competent to put England under an interdict or pronounce a condemnation or otherwise invoke some of those draconian measures designed to extort funds out of the public coffers in the way that had been otherwise threatened. Well, all of this, of course, didn't set well with the Roman Church, either in England or out of it. And in 1377, Wycliffe was summoned to appear before the Bishop of London. He went there under protection of his political protector, a man named Duke Lancaster, which is another interesting little side point. But it's interesting how most of these people who are theological reformers are only able to do their work because they have the protection of some prince, some political authority will guard their life. In the case of Wycliffe, it was Duke Lancaster. In the case of Huss, he had a political protector we'll see in a few minutes. Luther, of course, all his life was indebted to Duke Frederick, Elector of Saxony, who sort of protected him, and otherwise, he probably would have been burned at the stake early on, as some others were. But in any event, Wycliffe went to London under the protection of Duke Lancaster, represented himself there at this, as it were, a kind of a trial that took place. But nevertheless, the result of it was that he did come under the censure of the church. Pope Gregory was not there, but actually issued a condemnation of Wycliffe's writings and called on the Bishop of Canterbury in London to order Wycliffe to be imprisoned. The Bishop of Canterbury passed that order on to the Chancellor of Oxford, where Wycliffe was a professor, but he was also a very popular professor and had a very wide following. So the Chancellor at Oxford went to Wycliffe and said, "John, consider yourself imprisoned." And then that was it. He wasn't imprisoned. He just was to consider himself imprisoned. And John went about his business, and there was no great changes. So that did not really quite meet the expectations of the church, but it did speak to how much Wycliffe himself was enjoying the popular support, not only of his contemporaries there in the faculty, but in the popular press as well. Well, the Pope became increasingly vitriolic in condemning Wycliffe. I thought one great quote was, quote, "Wycliffe was vomiting out of the filthy dungeon of his heart the most wicked and damnable heresies." That's kind of the way they were describing him. He was classed as one of the most renowned of heretics. And the Pope actually issued what's called a papal bull. That's the word from which we get the word bulletin, by the way. It's one of those words we don't use very much, but anyway, it's a word that was essentially a condemnation of Wycliffe and an order that he be imprisoned and made to stand trial and probably pay for his life for his wayward ways. However, the same Pope that issued that bull in 1377, Pope Gregory XI, died in 1378. And that was the time when the papal schism erupted. So that was the end of the so-called Babylonian captivity and the beginning of the papal schism. And so this command from the Pope essentially evaporated in terms of its authority. No one took it very seriously. Wycliffe, at this point, has not really reached the maturity of his own thought. He's raising what amount to basically ecclesiastical criticisms, that is, criticisms of the church, and especially the Pope as a political, ecclesiastical figure. If we could distill probably the principal issues that he raised, there would be many more than these, but these would probably be at the heart of them and cover the essential points. He said that Christ's followers, referring to the Pope and the church, have no right to exact temporal goods by ecclesiastical censures. We've just talked about that a little bit. That the church does not have a legitimate right to tax people through government. That the support of the church should be strictly voluntary. To us, we kind of take that for granted, but obviously at that time in history, that was not taken for granted at all, and this was part of what was the impulse behind, eventually, the Reformation. Second, that the excommunications that were imposed by the Pope or the priest are of no avail if not according to the law of Christ. There was a certain idea that has been pretty much entrenched by this time, that whatever the Pope did or said was true by definition, that in a sense the Pope was above the law, and that even if the Pope did those things, which seemed to be beyond the scope even of what was legal by the law of Christ, nevertheless, in a sense, the Pope as the vicar of Christ had that authority. And so that, of course, would create a striking and shocking amount of potential for abuse, which some people thought they had been richly treated to by his behaviors. Well, Wycliffe is simply saying that when even the Pope, if he steps outside the law of Christ, is at that point deprived of any proper authority. This is really one of the first times you see the idea of what we call lex rex, the rule of law, being articulated clearly in history. We see something similar in the Magna Carta, which was about the same time frame, a little bit earlier. But nevertheless, this was a rising idea now in the West that there is law that should rule, and no human ruler can rise above it or step outside it, you see, which of course was very important in the American tradition as well. Third, for adequate reasons, the king may strip the church of its temporalities, meaning that if the church becomes unruly enough, the state has the authority to step in and actually divest the church of her property. Again, you can see that at the time that would have been regarded as a radical proposition because of the virtually infallible authority otherwise associated to the church. And finally, one of the most striking things, that even a pope could be lawfully impeached by laymen. That is, if a pope became wayward enough that pope would be properly exposed to removal by virtue of some kind of effort through proper ecclesiastical processes. Well, all of these things at the time were just radical. However they may set with us would be a separate question. But certainly at the time, Wycliffe was taking a striking stand against what was the popular sentiment with respect to how the Pope operates. He was defending England against foreign encroachment and largely against the papal encroachment. And, of course, the whole papal schism at this point served to, in some ways, add a great deal of ballast and momentum to his own message. I'd like to read to you briefly a quote which comes to us again from Philip Schaff. And he gives, I think, a good summary statement concerning Wycliffe and his impact in these words. Quote, "In sermons, tracts, and larger writings, Wycliffe brought scripture and common sense to bear. His pen was as keen as a Damascus blade. Irony and invective, of which he was the master, he did not hesitate to use. The directness and pertinency of his appeals brought them easily within the comprehension of the popular mind. He wrote not only in Latin, but in English. His conviction was as deep and his passion as fiery as Luther's. But on the one hand, Wycliffe's style betrays less the vivid illustrative power of the great German and little of his sympathetic warmth, while on the other, less of his unfortunate coarseness." If you catch that, the little comparison, Luther to, or Wycliffe to Luther, Luther is more powerful in his writing and in his person, more warm in his personality, but at the same time, Luther was also more given to abrupt and harsh and indeed coarse statements, probably that would be offensive to many of us by modern sensibilities in the ways that he would talk about some. In fact, Luther has forever been accused of the unfortunate things he said about Jewish people, which were at the time not the least bit uncommon. But of course now by modern standards we look at that and we're horrified to hear, the great reformer saying things like that. And I'm not going to rise to his defense in that connection except to say that in the age he was not doing anything that was the least bit out of the ordinary, but maybe pushing the envelope a little bit. Wycliffe was a lot more cautious and careful in his choice of words, and that's the point here. Continuing, as Luther is the most vigorous tract writer that Germany has produced, so Wycliffe is the foremost religious pamphleteer that has arisen in England. And the impression made by his clear and stinging thrusts may be contrasted in content and audience with the scholarly and finished tracts of the Oxford movement, led by Pusey and Keble and Newman, the one reaching the conscience, the other appealing to the aesthetic tastes, the one adapted to break down priestly pretension, the other to foster it. And so Wycliffe kind of stood out among those at Oxford for his willingness to take on, in no uncertain terms, the powers that be. In 1380, Wycliffe was very concerned that the message that he was promulgating there as a professor at Oxford should get to the people, as it were, get the word more on the street. And so to do that, he commissioned a group of people who came to be called the poor priests. These were not ordained people. They weren't ecclesiastics at all. but with a certain amount of limited training, they were simply sent out to preach, as it were, in the public square, the message which essentially had been worked out by Wycliffe. These had a striking appearance to them. They wore these kind of long, russet gowns that all looked the same. So there was kind of a uniform that they wore, and they went out, they traveled on foot, and they really did have quite an impact on the popular culture. They would preach in the open air, and large groups would gather, and so Wycliffe's efforts and movement really was put on feet more or less by these so-called poor priests who went out preaching in England. The fact that they had an impact is testified to by the comment from Bishop Courtney in London, who was the most important Roman Catholic in England at the time, who described these poor priests in these words, quote, "as itinerant, unauthorized preachers who teach erroneous, yea, heretical assertions publicly, not only in churches, but also in public squares and other profane places, and who do this under the guise of great holiness, but without having obtained any ecclesiastical or papal authorization." So obviously the church had a very negative reaction to these poor priests who were out dispensing the teachings of Wycliffe on the street. The turning point came for John Wycliffe in 1381. It was there that he dared to take on probably the most deeply cherished belief of the Roman Catholic Church, so that even many of his followers were shaken. And in fact, this was one of those situations where many of his followers no longer went with him. It reminds me very much of the story of Jesus in John chapter 6, when Jesus gives the bread of life discourse and says words that were so shocking to the original hearers. "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you'll have no part of me," you know. And it says many of his followers turned back. This is a hard saying. We don't know about this. This is, they're sort of wandering away. And that's when Jesus raises the question, "Will you also leave me?" And Peter says, "Well, where can we go? You're the one that has the words of eternal life." Well, in an interesting way, it's the sacraments that also sort of precipitates a similar crisis with Wycliffe, because he actually tackles in 1381 the Roman Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. Transubstantiation, the teaching that the that the substance of the bread and wine become the very substance, corporeally, the substance of the body and blood of Christ, while the external appearances, the accidents, as they say, remain the same. At that point, the doctrine of transubstantiation had been so deeply impressed into the popular conscience that this is the way of salvation, that this is what you need, and that unless Christ is actually there, unless this is truly an offering of his body and blood, another sacrifice as it were, and we're taking that grace into ourselves, our salvation is lost. And for Wycliffe to challenge that point really did raise serious questions about the ongoing support that he might enjoy. As that took place, there was, in 1382, in response to that, a synod that was convened in London that was called the Earthquake Synod. And it gained that name because it actually was interrupted by an earthquake. And the earthquake didn't do any great deal of damage, but it did, as you can imagine, upset the attendees to some degree. The Courtney, who was the Bishop of Canterbury in London, interpreted the earthquake as a sign from God that the earth was about to open its mouth and swallow Wycliffe. So that was his spin. Wycliffe, for his part, interpreted the earthquake as an indication of God's judgment coming against this damnable process, you see, that was going to ultimately condemn him. But in any event, the synod did proceed. Wycliffe was condemned and found to be heretical. 24 particular articles of Wycliffe were found to be inconsistent with Catholic teaching, including the issue of the sacrament. He taught that oral confession prior to death is not necessary for the salvation of one's soul, the extreme unction, as it's called in Catholic sacramental theology. That after the death of Urban VI, that England had the right to be independent from the Catholic Church, which eventually did happen with the formation of the Anglican Church about 300 years later. and so on. All of these were condemned. Wycliffe was condemned, and as a result of that, then a new conference took place in Oxford, or at Oxford, in which Wycliffe was going to stand trial. He had lost enough support that his own protector suggested to him that rather than raising this issue and taking those risks, maybe he should simply voluntarily exile himself, and Wycliffe, who was in somewhat failing health at that moment, agreed. And so the trial did not actually take place as booked, but Wycliffe actually went into a kind of semi-retirement at that point. He did continue to preach, he did continue to write, and in fact it was during that period of time when he was in exile that he actually translated the Bible into English. So the thing for which we remember him the most took place during that period of time when he was actually out of the public eye. Not unlike, again, Luther, you may recall, who after the Diet of Worms is kidnapped and swept away to Wartburg Castle, where he's holed up for a couple of years, and it's there that he translates the Bible into German. So we find that sometimes these people, the little turn of events that seems to be negative, actually creates the opportunity for them to make their greatest contribution, and one of the things for which they're most famous. In any event, shortly thereafter, after he finished that translation, Wycliffe suffered a stroke, which did partially paralyze him, but he did continue to do some writing and speaking, but shortly thereafter suffered a second stroke, and in fact died on December 29th, 1384, right in the midst of celebrating the Lord's Supper with some followers. So he died at the very moment that he was involved in that act of worship. It's been stated, this was from a contemporary description of Wycliffe, quote, he was sparse and probably never of robust health, but he was not an ascetic. He was fond of a good meal. In temper he was quick, in mind clear, in moral character unblemished. Towards his enemies he was sharp, but never coarse or ribald. William Thorpe, a young contemporary standing in the court of Archbishop Arundel, bore testimony that, quote, he was emaciated in body and well nigh destitute of strength, but in conduct most innocent. Very many of the chief men of England conferred with him, loved him dearly, wrote down his sayings, and followed his manner of life. 2 years after his burial, on order of the Catholic Church, his bones were exhumed and burned publicly, and then the ashes from that burning were cast to the four winds. This was calculated to be highly insulting, of course, to Wycliffe, but later commentators have observed that casting his ashes to the four winds was probably symbolic of spreading the seeds of the Reformation, which would eventually grow and take root. And so it was a sort of a poetic anticipation of the influence he would have. Wycliffe, during his lifetime and afterwards, had many followers, not only in England but around the world, but probably the most important follower of Wycliffe, and certainly the most famous, was another man whose name was John Huss. And John Huss is associated with the city of Prague. Huss is one of the great figures of the history of Prague, as you're undoubtedly aware. Huss did establish himself a religious movement which did survive, and to this day there is a movement called the Moravians, which would have its roots going back to Huss. Wycliffe, there was a movement that came after Wycliffe called the Lollards, which had its roots in Wycliffe, but he was not, strictly speaking, the founder of that movement, so we wouldn't tie it to him quite as directly. At the time, Prague had become quite an important center of European culture. In 1347, before the birth of Huss, the University of Prague was founded. It was the first of the great German universities. But that sort of university town that was established around the university itself created once again a culture in which it was at least permissible to raise on an academic level questions about European life, about the proper place of the papacy and that kind of thing. And so Huss himself was born into that atmosphere and absorbed it very early. There was at the time also a close connection between Bohemia and England. The sister of the king of Bohemia was married to the king of England. And so there was a great deal of interaction, a friendly relationship between the two, and of course a passing back and forth of a lot of the academic and popular literature of the two nations. And so Wycliffe's writings were actually known to have been widely circulated in Bohemia as early as 1380, which was about 4 years before he died. Huss himself was born in 1369. His name means goose, and he often played on that term, referring to himself as the goose. He would write to his followers, for example, when he was imprisoned, awaiting his execution some years later, obviously, he wrote to his followers and prayed and asked that they would pray for the soon release of the goose, and that was the kind of way that he would describe himself. But in any event, he was born of poor parents, but he was a brilliant child, and by academic acumen and really a beautiful singing voice, he was able to go through the University of Prague there. He sang on the, literally on the sidewalks to get some donations from passers-by, and that was the way he earned his living and made it through college. By the way, there's another famous figure in church history who was able to sing his way through the university, and his name was Martin Luther. We're going to see that again next week. He was a wonderful singer, a brilliant tenor voice, as the reputation goes. In any event, Huss acquired not only a bachelor's degree, but a divinity degree, a master's degree, all of these around the late 1390s. In 1402, he became the rector of one of the major churches in Prague, which was called the Chapel of Holy Innocents of Bethlehem, usually just referred to as the Bethlehem Chapel. And Huss, throughout his life, was essentially doing his work as the preacher and teacher of the Bethlehem Chapel, but also he was an academic and was on the faculty at the University of Prague, and so he was another kind of like Wycliffe, who both preached and taught, and the platform for those presentations was largely the university, but most importantly, Bethlehem Chapel. He was known early on as a defender of Wycliffe's teaching. In fact, originally was called a Wycliffeite, although he actually became more prominent than Wycliffe, and so the term was changed eventually to being a Hussite. And so, but Wycliffe himself, of course, was Huss was identified with Wycliffe. This preaching and teaching on behalf of Wycliffe in 1402 did arouse some popular sentiment against him, particularly at this point of the doctrine of transubstantiation that was highly controversial. It was a kind of a lightning rod for controversy in that whole process. In 1403, only a year after he'd taken this position, a new archbishop was assigned in Prague, whose name was Zbinko of Hasenberg, with whom he actually enjoyed an early good relationship, but after a couple of years, Huss's reputation had become widespread enough and controversial enough that the Pope at the time, Innocent VII, ordered Zbinko to stamp out Wycliffism and especially to shut the mouth of Huss. Well, Huss was not so easily stopped. He continued to preach and so on. But finally, in 1408, Huss was deposed from his position as being the preacher at Bethlehem Chapel. And that seemed to be kind of an end to what was a rising, brilliant career. But because of a completely unrelated political turmoil at the university, about 3/4 of the faculty left, and most of the student body left. And so the University of Prague, which had been a major European university, overnight plummeted to a position of much more modest importance. But it just so happened that the people who were left, after all of these folks had departed, were the great supporters of Huss. And so he was deposed in 1408, but was reinstated in 1409, back in the chapel, back preaching once again, nothing daunted by all of that little turmoil. People continued to flock to him in great numbers, and it was, again, one of the same situations where it was arousing, continuing, and increasing controversy in the church. Zbinko himself was ordered by the Pope to seize and burn all of Wycliffe's writings, from which Huss was basically operating. There was a huge bonfire that took place in Prague about that time, which was deeply protested by many of the followers of Huss. 2 days later, a sentence of excommunication was pronounced on Huss himself. But he continued to preach at Bethlehem Chapel, continued to raise a disturbance and a commotion for the positions that he was taking, and so on. Finally, the church demanded that Huss appear and stand trial for his teachings, which he refused. And for that, it set in process a series of events that essentially led to either his capture and imprisonment, or once again, that he would voluntarily go into exile. And so Wenzel, who was his political protector, urged him, as Lancaster had earlier urged Wycliffe, to go into exile. So in 1412, Huss essentially voluntarily resigned his position at the chapel and went into a self-imposed exile. He continued to preach, but he was preaching more or less just in a popular way, not with any official status or sanction. Now, if you recall, 2 weeks ago when we were together, we talked about the Council of Constance, and it was one of the councils that had been convened by the church to try to heal the schism, the papal schism that had come into place. And that council actually convened in 1414. Huss went into his exile in 1412. And so this council, which was primarily intended to try to address the issue that there were now 3 popes out there, also, by the by, was dealing with the problem of heretics, chief of whom at that time was Huss, Jerome of Prague, and certain others that were more or less aligned with Huss. And so Huss was ordered to go and answer for his teachings at Constance. He said he would only do so if he was given a safe conduct, which would typically guarantee his safety to go and come without fear of loss of life or limb. And he was given that by the emperor, that Huss would have safe conduct. And so on that basis and with that assurance, he traveled to Constance and was given some freedom of movement around the city at first, finally had his first session with the gathered authorities, and after a few cordialities over a couple of days, it became clear that Huss was not going to recant his teachings, very similar to Luther's experience. And so Huss at that point was imprisoned, given time to think about it. Now, the prison they put him into was a dungeon with a dirt floor, and it was about an inch deep in water, and it was filled with vermin, and it was the most unspeakable and horrendous circumstances, and he was left there for about 6 months to think about it. And so during that time, he had a great loss of health, and disease, of course, set in, as you can well imagine, so that by the end of that period of time, he was a broken man physically. And they brought him back in now to the council to ask once again if he would care to reconsider his position with respect to his teachings. And he courageously declined to do so after several sessions and attempts to persuade him so to do. And even in his broken state of health, he was able to muster the courage to say that he was not going to recant his teachings. And so on that basis, he was condemned to die by burning at the stake. The record is that at that moment he lifted his eyes and looked at the emperor who had guaranteed him safe conduct and whose responsibility it was to protect him from this very eventuality. And the record is that all the emperor could do was not even meet his gaze, but just lower his eyes to the ground. He was basically betrayed, and so there was no protection given him. He was the very same day taken to a location about a half a mile away where the stake and the, sort of the pit there where he was going to be executed had already been prepared. He was tied to the stake, and the record is that as they lit the flame, or lit the fire, he began to sing. And he sang a song that was associated with the Reform movement of the day. He sang, and of course he was had a beautiful voice, as we've indicated, and in spite of his broken health, he still, at this last moment, rallied the strength to sing nobly and courageously. As he reached the second stanza of the hymn, the flames finally reached his face and extinguished his voice. But, of course, the sound of his voice continued to reverberate, and his death, as Tertullian notes, the blood of the martyr tends to be the seed of the church. His death did not by any means extinguish the movement which he had started, And indeed, it's no accident that Martin Luther, who was born about 50 years later, was considered and called and charged with the crime of being a Hussite. So the contribution of Huss continued.